Hi, everyone. Here we are for a supplemental episode on Galt speech. This is part of the Atlas Project Live. I'm Greg Salmieri. This is Ben Bayer. We're coming to you today from my office studio in the bottom of my apartment here in Jersey City, where Ben's visiting. You'll be with us on Tuesday also.
Yeah, it's nice to have a in-person chat. We don't have to worry about as many technical problems. And New York's so lovely this time of year.
Yeah, it really was the first very nice day.
Well, I was being somewhat facetious because you guys just got hit by a snowstorm.
Yeah, but then everything melted right away. It's been really lovely, and I didn't even have a jacket on. You were all bundled up with your scarf and mittens when we were walking around.
Spoiled by the South.
But,
you forgot to introduce our third companion.
Oh yes, with us here tonight. Sorry, let me just pull down the titles. With us here tonight is Alan Gotthelf, or at least his sculpted head. Alan was a professor of mine and a good friend, and he's come up on this broadcast several times before as having made a summary of Galt's speech that we talked about on Tuesday, as the co-editor with me of a companion to Ayn Rand, and in general as a scholar of Rand and teacher of mine, and person of account. And he passed away a few years ago, and one of his friends and mine, Stuart Feldman, really a quite gifted sculptor, has done some public monuments and really nice pieces, some for the Franklin Mint years ago. Anyway, the idea came up late in his life for him to sculpt Alan's head, and he did it back in 2013, but it was just finished and cast into bronze, and I have one of the first copies here. So we thought we'd invite him over to the table to join us while we talk about this.
It's really nice.
Yeah, Stuart also is working on a sculpture of Atlas.
Pooja asks, did he do it using photos? Did Stuart sculpt this using photos?
Alan was still alive when he did it, and he took some measurements, but I think it was finished just after he died, or certainly was very ill, and he also made reference to photos. And Stuart knew Alan very well. They were friends. Stuart was actually a student of his at Pratt Academy back in the 60s, or early 70s, I guess. Anyway, so here we have Alan joining us in bronze. So our purpose today is to just continue the discussion of Galt's speech. We are at chapter 7 of part 3 of the novel, which is where the speech occurs. And, we got a good distance into it on Tuesday, and we're going to continue and want to finish it this Tuesday. So we thought we'd just spend some time on bits from the first half or so of the speech that we didn't cover as fully as we might have, so that we'll have a good running start to finish it on Tuesday, because we don't want to do yet another supplemental on the speech. We'll probably have one or two more on one of the later chapters. All right, so what topics? I had one topic, and people online should feel free to write in the comments with topics. We're reading them now, and so we'll notice if you say anything. I wanted to talk about just briefly one thing that happens in the chapter prior to the speech that we didn't cover, and then we'll talk about the speech. We'll put up the structure of it again, and we'll just make a few comments on the early section. It's been a lot of time on the material on the morality of death today. But one of the things that's interesting is when Jim first tells Dagny, he comes and he's insistently jamming on the doorbell, and he tells her about Reardon's having disappeared. There's some discussion about other people at the mills who left at the same time. And Betsy, some months ago, or weeks ago, I think months ago, writing in the spoilers group, it's now no longer a spoiler, posted about something that I've always noticed, which is that one of the people who goes missing is Gwen Ives, the secretary who's portrayed very sympathetically, and I've always liked her as a character. Alan always used to think she was perfect for Eddie. We'd talk about that they should have ended up together, or in a different circumstance might have. But there's the question of whether she goes on strike. whether she goes to the Valley. And this, I think, was the context in which Betsy
And
brought
that's
it
not
up.
just a question about her, it's a question about all the people who
Yeah.
quit along with him.
I think so. And I don't think it's clear from what's written. Do you want to just read that passage?
Let's see. Nobody knows how it got out, but it went through the mills like one of those furnace breakouts, the word that he'd gone, and then before anyone could stop it, a whole bunch of them vanished. The superintendent, the chief metallurgist, the chief engineer, Reardon's secretary, even the hospital doctor, the same one that presumably patched him up at the end of that scene with the attack on the factory. I mean, I guess it's consistent with what's here that he quits, and then because word of his quitting gets out, they just decide to quit independently on their own.
Right. That's what Jim assumed happened, right?
Yeah.
Now, so if Jim's right, and Jim might know something that makes this have to be right about the timeline when it happened, then they've all gone deserter, like Bill Brent, and like a lot of other people. And the fact that Reardon went is what stimulated them to do this. But the other possibility is that, Reardon had this talk with Francisco, and maybe before going, he said to some of his, key people or trusted people or people he thought well of or thought would come, let's ask this guy along. We don't know. We do know that some of the other people, Francisco has definitely brought people from Denkonia Copper in on the strike. For one thing, when they were in the Valley, he said, I've got someone now running my mills who used to be my best metallurgist in Chile, and now he's here running the mills. And of course, all of the best people, the most able, most selfish, as the radio announcer, people that the government had been counting on to run the mines after they were nationalized, they disappeared at the same moment that Francisco did. So there it wasn't. They learned Francisco left.
Right.
That was orchestrated, and clearly Francisco had a lot of people in on it with him who were his employees and went to join the strike. Reardon couldn't have, he couldn't have had his employees know beforehand, because he didn't know beforehand. But it could be that he and Francisco got together that night with a couple of people and said, look, I'm quitting, and here's what's happening, and you can come.
I mean, on top of that, there's just the fact that throughout the book so far, the outside world, people from Jim's perspective, have assumed that it's something of a coincidence, or at least they did for a long time assume it was something of a coincidence that all these people were disappearing. And we know, in fact, that there was somebody behind the scenes who was organizing it all. So this could just be another case of that.
And the fact that they don't know how it got out so quickly, it could have gotten out so quickly because Reardon sent word to them.
Yeah.
So we don't know. It's certainly possible that those people went to the Valley. This came up in a discussion on the spoilers page about sort of what the admission criteria for the Valley are. And my view is that they only look for a certain type of person that they're reaching out for, the one whose disappearance is going to hobble the world economy. But there are definitely other people who are welcome there. The guy who's a trucker but didn't intend to remain one and so forth. He must have been an acquaintance of somebody who somebody brought in on it because they realized what kind of person he was, not because he'd already reached some great distinction, right? And it's possible some of Reardon's employees are in this targets of opportunity, as they call them in academic hiring. The kind
They
of
use very
opportunity
different
they have in
standards,
mind
right?
are different. Yeah. Pooja says she finds reading Galt's speech to be so slow, with a lot of O's, and any tips for how to get through it?
I have two different tips.
Go ahead.
One is, if you really must go faster, use an audiobook. And I've had a lot of success doing what they are calling these days immersive reading, where you listen to the audiobook and read along with the print version at the same time. You pick up a little bit more that way, including disparities between Tumblr and Tumbril. But the other tip is go slower.
Going slower helps?
Going slower is good. Right now, I'm making an outline for myself of the whole speech, writing one sentence per paragraph, which is
Kind of recapitulating Alan's method of summarizing it.
I take it that's what he did too.
Yeah.
And it's really helping me to digest it better. Now, that's in part because I'm working on this project and not everybody is, so it's not there's no categorical imperative to do it that way.
Yeah, but it's a good way to do it. Working with an outline is also helpful. You kind of, it gets you to see the parts better. We have just the simple kind of 5-part outline is here, and just looking at that and knowing where you are in it can help, and maybe dividing it so that you read a section at a time can be helpful. Also, there's the kind of long, detailed outline that's in Essays on Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged that I did in the appendix. Could also just having something like that to hold the structure so that you can see when you're transitioning can be very helpful in reading a long piece. But anyway, we wanted to talk about the speech and its relation to Rand's philosophy, because the speech is something you can make a study of on its own, and it's one of the documents that comes close to being a full presentation of her philosophy, or kind of a summary of her philosophy as a whole, rather than of one particular point from it. So we might want to say something about that, and people study it sometimes in that connection. And Ben's got For the New Intellectual open, and I take it the reason for that is that in For the New Intellectual, Galt's speech, so For the New Intellectual is a book that starts with a long essay called For the New Intellectual, and after that it's just excerpts of material from her various novels, and each of the excerpts begins with a little kind of italicized bit that's identifying what it is and providing some context for it in the novel. And there are several things from Atlas Shrugged that are in here. The Francisco's speech on money, Francisco's conversation with Reardon on sex is in here, a few of the other scenes between Reardon and Francisco. But this speech is in there as well, and this speech is prefaced just, this is the philosophy of objectivism.
You
And
can see that, but
yeah.
this is the first edition. This was the first of the nonfiction books that she published, just 4 years after Atlas.
And by that time, when she wrote Atlas, she had come up with a name for her philosophy, which is objectivism. And so at that point, I mean, she would go on to write more and to cover some topics that aren't covered in Galt's speech or really in Atlas at all. But at that time, at least, she was comfortable presenting Galt's speech as a presentation of objectivism. So for people who are interested in her philosophy apart from her fiction, and I think the philosophy and the fiction are so intertwined, but for people who are interested in studying philosophy apart from the fiction, some of them study Galt's speech on its own. The speech raises a lot of topics that are both discussed elsewhere in Atlas Shrugged, but also covered in other nonfiction works by Ayn Rand, and there's then now a secondary literature on Ayn Rand's philosophy that includes some really good works. And just for people who are not familiar with that already but are getting into Rand through the novel, I thought we should mention a few of those in connection with this. And by far the most significant book, not by Ayn Rand, for studying Ayn Rand's work is Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff, which is a comprehensive and systematic presentation of her whole philosophy, and a presentation of it in hierarchical order. So Rand thought there was a real order, a kind of structure to philosophy that started with these axioms, which we've discussed in Galt's speech, and goes through to the theory of knowledge. The axioms are part of metaphysics, the study of reality, goes through to the theory of knowledge, which is called epistemology, and then into ethics, and from ethics into politics and aesthetics. And
interesting, that was the order that she was originally going to write the speech itself in. If you look in her journals, you see, and we used a page from those journals with that order as promotional material for the project when we were getting started. But then she decided that this was not the way you would write a philosophical speech in the context of a novel.
Yeah,
that there should be more motivation at the beginning and starting with morality.
Yeah, because what Galt's doing is not just presenting a philosophy, right? He's presenting a philosophy as a manifesto for strikers who are leading a strike and speaking to a world against whom they're on strike, trying to recruit people to it. So you really have to read this speech both as a presentation of a philosophy and a kind of speech act in the context of a plot given by a certain character. And so you have to kind of keep both of these perspectives on it. But anyway, for a presentation of the philosophy in order, so to speak, an order that's discussed and implied by the speech in Atlas Shrugged, but not the order in which it's laid out in Atlas Shrugged or in any of Rand's other works. This book by Peikoff is really fantastic. It's based on a course that she authorized that he gave while she was alive. The book was written after her death, that she authorized. It's the only complete presentation of the theoretical the structure of her philosophy that she knew to be accurate and that she would endorse.
A course which you can listen to on the Ayn Rand Institute campus website, by the way.
Yes, the original course, which is a little bit
some of her interjections, which are
differently structured than the book, but yeah, the whole course is up there for historical reasons, and the course is very good, as well as the book, being they're both excellent in somewhat different ways. So that's, I think, the main thing the main nonfiction secondary source on it. Always, I'm plugging a companion to Ayn Rand, which is a book that Alan and I co-edited, and it's a collection of essays by various scholars of Rand on different aspects of her thought, including the different departments of philosophy.
It's got a pretty good index.
Got a pretty good index that Ben prepared. Two other books I think stand out. One is by the Ayn Rand Society, published by the Ayn Rand Society, which is a group of philosophers interested in Rand's work, edited by Alan Gotthelf again and Jim Lennox. Meta-Ethics, Egoism, and Virtue. It's a collection on Rand's ethical theory. And there are a lot of different essays in here by different philosophers, but I think of particular use is the first essay in here by Darrell Wright.
Darrell's is really excellent and cleared up a lot of questions I had about some of the issues we're going to talk about later tonight, I hope, about the relationship between choice and reason and Rand's ultimate value, but we'll talk a little bit more about that.
And one thing that's really nice about Darrell's essay too is all of these ideas and all the ideas she's challenging in the speech, have a place in the history of philosophy. She's challenging certain old ideas, reviving certain ideas in a new way. There's all these kinds of questions, particularly if you're a philosophy student, that you're going to have about how does what she's saying relate to the various views in the history of philosophy, to Hume and the is-ought gap and Plato and G.E. Moore and other people. And Darrell does a really nice job situating the kind of basis of her moral theory relative to other views. There's also a lot of situating material of that sort
if there are
in the companion
philosophy
as well.
students out there watching either live or the recorded version sometime in the future, you should definitely get in touch and let us know you're out there and what you think about this. And don't forget about the essay contest about Atlas Shrugged. We'd love to have philosophy students write about that. Ayn Rand Institute has an essay contest about Atlas Shrugged. We went up to $10,000. I'm supposed to plug that, so anyway. Greg gets to plug his books. I get to plug the Institute's programs.
Another book worth recommending here. A lot of Galt's speech and a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight, I think, is about the different virtues that Galt talks about. And Tara Smith has a couple of useful books on Ayn Rand's ethics. There's another one, Viable Values, which is up on the shelf. But the one I'm holding, and I think the probably most useful in this connection, is his book, Ayn Rand's Normative Ethics, which is about the virtues, and she has a chapter on each of the virtues.
And it's a book that's had some impact. There have been a number of non-objectivist philosophers who've noticed the book and who've read it and who've written about it, and it's influenced some of their work on virtue theory regarding other philosophers. Yeah, and there's actually some follow-up discussion connected to that book in this meta-ethics, egoism, and virtue. The Ayn Rand Society's books grow out of sessions that the Society has, conferences of philosophers or meetings at philosophy conventions, and there was an author meets critic section on Tara's book that we had some people at. And one of the issues that came up last time, which is I think Jean had asked about, well, what are these virtues? Are they actions or character traits? And that's a question that came up from people commenting on Tara's book, and there's some good discussion of that, I think, in this book, Meta-Ethics, Egoism, and Virtue, edited by Gotthelf and Lennox. Also discussion of that in the companion, edited by Gotthelf and me. So there's our book recommending section. Of course, there's also Ayn Rand's own nonfiction books, and of particular relevance to the topics we're going to talk about tonight, I think, are the books of The Virtue of Selfishness, especially the first essay, The Objectivist Ethics, and the essay Causality versus Duty, which is in the book Philosophy Who Needs It, and several of the other essays in Philosophy Who Needs It, I think, are relevant. Okay, so
those are our recommendations and introductory topics. We talked really about the first section, the introduction, and section 2, the morality of life last time, and just started talking about section 3, the morality of death. And what I'd like to do with the rest of today is just make some points that we hadn't made about the morality of life, maybe a point or two about the introduction if anyone has anything to raise. And people online, please feel free to chime in with comments on any of this. So I'd like to do that. And also to talk about section 3, the morality of death. And then what I think we'll do on Tuesday is maybe we'll open up with a few kind of comments wrapping up things on the morality of death. But what I'd like the main business to be to talk about the section on the mystics, or your teachers, I called it here, and then to spend most of our time on the final section of the speech, the choose life section. So that's the agenda for today and Tuesday. And I'm just seeing if I can get the comments to load up. Yeah, this is the current version of the comments, because I'm not comfortable not being able to see what people are saying. I have to trust Ben, and I don't know if I can trust him to repeat the comments I want to hear. Okay. Good. You were discussing. Pooja points out something really interesting.
Yeah.
When we were talking about the earlier issue of what about, what happened to these Reardon steelworkers and how they find out so quickly he quit. Pooja said maybe, Francisco was working there for months as Frank Adams. Maybe he was, prospecting some people while he was working there, and he was.
I just don't see Pooja's comment. So there's something strange.
This is really weird. So I'm only showing 11 people watching, and you're showing.
Are we putting up 2 different streams at the same time? Because I see 2 of them on the Atlas page.
More people. And I think that's what's happening. I think what's happening is the stream I'm sending to live stream is redirecting to the Atlas page.
Yeah, that's it.
And so I should have just sent to live stream, because live stream is configured to echo to the Atlas page, and I didn't realize that. And now I'm sending simultaneously to Facebook
different links
and live stream. Okay, so that's what's going on. So I'm going to watch this small one, this 9-person one, and you watch the big one.
Let's not stop anything at this point. We can.
Yes, I agree. But this way we'll see the different comments one way or the other.
That's the problem.
Okay.
That's very strange.
So this is all confusing.
For those who are just joining us, we've had some problems tonight getting the
weird.
working link out, and we've just discovered part of the reason, but we don't have to do anything
Agreed.
to mess with it anymore right now.
All right, so just the one point I want to make connected to the introduction of Galt's speech is that throughout the speech, it's a speech being given by this character in this circumstance to these people. And Ben, you've pointed out on Tuesday, and I think we'll point out more tonight, a lot of places in which the content of the speech echoes or relates to plot events, or there are plot events that illustrate it. But there's also another thing to notice, which is that Galt is referring to himself, and Galt is regularly referencing himself and his audience, and talking about what they need to do, what he's doing, what he's done to them. And he's talking about all of these philosophical principles in connection with this action that he's instigated of a strike by the men of the mind against the rest of society. Almost in every section, certainly in every one of these 5 major sections, and even in most of the subsections that I've divided down into, he's always bringing it back to we, the men of the mind, and you, the people who we're on strike against. Okay. What shall we move on to? Let's move to the morality of life section.
Yeah.
And Ben, what do you have some topics you want to talk about under that, honey?
Several, but the main one that I wanted to discuss is something that's come up recently for me in my other teaching, at the Objectivist Academic Center.
Oh, that reminds me of
And,
something else we wanted to say, which
is a program run by the Ayn Rand Institute for people who are interested in learning more about objectivism and how it relates to other philosophies. And by the way, our applications will be opening soon, so you should be on the lookout for that. I think the deadline's the middle of July. In any case, we've been reading some of Rand's nonfiction ethical works. You mentioned the objectivist ethics in The Virtue of Selfishness. And something that I've noticed is that, and I think this is not the first time that I've noticed this, but a lot of students who read that essay, and likewise who read the comparable material that's in the speech, tend to, if you ask them the question, why does Ayn Rand think we need morality? A lot of them will focus on the material that we spent a good amount of time talking about in class, that we spent talking about in the broadcast on Tuesday, about the way in which she thinks the concept of value is based on the concept of life, that it's only living organisms that face the fundamental alternative of existence and non-existence, and they need to follow a definite course of action in order to achieve their life, etc., which is really important stuff for her. But the other half of the equation for her that's just as important for why we need morality, why we need moral values, is the fact that we have free will, the fact that we make choices. And choices, I mean, the way that Ankar Gate puts it sometimes is that it's choice all the way down, that it's not just that you have to choose the values that are necessary means to some end. You have to choose the end. You have to choose to want to live and to turn your mind on to even care about it in the first place. And that gets underappreciated, I think, by a lot of students who are reading her nonfiction and looking at this speech. And there's quite a lot about it in the speech. And
I mean, saying you have to choose to want to live is an interesting formulation, because you can't normally choose what you want. And in a sense you can, and in a sense you can't. You choose to live. And there's some questions about what choosing to live looks like and means. There might be, existential circumstances where it's an open question alive in your mind, to be or not to be. You're Hamlet. Or there's actually a moment in Atlas Shrugged that I think of as like this, when Reardon is faced with the Equalization of Opportunity bill, and he has a thought like, why should he ever do anything again if this is going to be the end of it? And I think there he's like thinking, why should I live? Why should I go on? So there are cases where just because you're depressed, or because you've had a tremendous setback, or something's happened that challenges the things that you lived for and that your life was about, where you actually are thinking, do I want to go on? So and that's the case where you actively choose to live. There are other cases where the issue might not confront you in so bleak terms as should I live or die, but you are making a choice to go after or pursue something in reality, and to go after, to pursue, to embrace what is and what's real, as opposed to what? Well, as opposed to a different kind of motivation that's just fleeing and trying to get away from things. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we talk about the morality of death, which is about fleeing and getting away from things. But in these choices you make to go after, to commit yourself to something, to pursue it, right? When you're making those kinds of choices, you are choosing life, you are valuing life, you're valuing existence, something in existence. And as you work to put more and more of those things together, right, to sorry, I'm adjusting the computer. I won't do that. As you think about how those values fit together into a larger whole, and you start valuing that larger whole and wanting that larger whole, and thinking of the parts of the individual things you value and are going after as parts of this larger life that you're valuing going after, and each made better by the contributions they make to the other, that's what it's like to really value your life. And if you do that and you get into the habit of doing that and pursuing those kinds of things over time, what that amounts to is an emotion that you feel all the time of wanting to live and of being happy with your life. Or if you're not happy because something concrete is wrong with your life, wanting really to fix that so that you have a better life, so that you have a life that you're happy with. And that's what wanting to live is about. And that is not automatic. That's something you have to develop.
And by the way, I think you see that summing process that you just described illustrated really well in the scene way at the beginning of the book when we're meeting Reardon for the first time and we're seeing all the different Reardon industries adding up to
Reardon
Reardon life.
limestone, yes, exactly.
Nothing subtle there.
And in the scene where we have Tony the wet nurse who sticks his neck out for the first time, right? And that's when he really realizes what it is to want to live and that he really wants it. And if he kept doing that, right, there'd be more and more things like that he'd stick his neck out for, that he'd commit himself to, that he'd treat as important and worth pursuing. And they would reinforce one another more and more. And it would amount to an intensifying desire to live, where that has some content. It's not just a fear of life, a fear of death, rather. And you see Galt saying this all the time. Your fear of death is not a love of life and will not help you to live it. He says things like that more than once. That's a direct quote from the speech, but he says things like that more than once in the speech, and we'll see after the speech this is a theme he returns to in a few contexts.
Another issue that I wanted to discuss briefly also happens to be something we've been discussing lately in the Objectivist Academic Center, which is the difference between life as the standard and the purpose of morality as your own life. Mm-hmm. And this is also, those are easy, I think, to confuse with each other just a little bit. You'll notice that she uses the same language when she gets later to the morality of death and how she names it has a standard and it has a different purpose. Uh-huh. And so one question is just, what is the difference? Mm-hmm. Is she different from other philosophers in this regard in looking at both of these things? I think she is.
Yeah, me too.
And where, in particular, the standard part, I think, is newer. Lots of philosophers have talked about purpose.
Arguably Aristotle, he doesn't have the word standard, but I think Aristotle has the idea of a standard. But what I don't think he has is this clear difference between standard and purpose.
That's for sure.
I think what he's talking about is nearer to a standard than a purpose.
And part of what's important about it, I think, and distinctive for her, is that it's what she thinks, at least, is adding the credibility of a science to it. And this is something Aristotle thinks he doesn't have. He says ethics is not a precise or an exact science.
I think that's a little... I did a talk for Ocon a few years back on man's life as the standard of value in Ayn Rand and Aristotle, and I thought it was good, but not quite as much time as I wanted to take on the material, and there was some interest in having it on Ayn Rand campus, so we recorded a much longer version of that for campus, where I went through what I thought were all the similarities and differences here. I think it was some good material, and that's somewhere...
Is this the stuff where you're saying that you think for... Aristotle doesn't quite have a standard, but he has like a quasi-standard where he says you should live like a Rorkish life.
Well, that was the earlier course I gave a long time ago called Aristotle as Ethicist, which I still think is pretty good. But I have new things to say which are better, or had as of a few years ago, and we recorded this several-hour-long course on this, I think 2 or 3 hours, and it's, I don't know, it's somewhere on a computer somewhere at ARI being eventually maybe get ready for campus.
Part of the reason that I'm asking about the standard focus on standard is just because it is language. It's not coming up in the speech for the first time. Mm-hmm. It comes up most explicitly in conversations between Francisco and Reardon.
What's their standard? What's your standard? By what right?
By what standard?
Yeah.
And it comes up especially when Francisco is first pointing out to Reardon, you're the only moral man here. Yeah. And Reardon's surprised by this. What do you mean I'm moral? Mm-hmm. And that's when Francisco tries to make these analogies between you judge your metal by the purest of standards, and it's kind of a scientific, technical kind of engineering sort of term.
Yeah, but I don't think that's the difference there between Rand and Aristotle. Even though Aristotle says ethics isn't scientific, first of all, what he means by scientific is something somewhat different from what Rand would mean by it. But also, I mean, he talks about standards or targets to aim at. You have to, something you might even translate as standard, and that there's disagreement over what it is, and we need to erect some thing that we'll look to make our judgments about what's good and bad. Anyway, hopefully, I know Carrie Ann Biondi, who's always with us in New York, is doing, and is in the chat now, is doing a lecture on Rand and Aristotle. She's also an Aristotle scholar. Is doing a lecture on Rand and Aristotle at a conference that's taking place this summer in Richmond, so it might be that she has some thoughts on this, which she'll share then. Carrie Ann and I haven't talked too much about this. I don't know if we see eye to eye on it or not. I think there are a lot of important differences between Rand and Aristotle here, as well as similarities, and Carrie Ann may well also think that. But what I see is not that Aristotle is missing this idea of a standard. It's just that it's not, standard and purpose are kind of run together in most philosophy. It's not made as just a point made to distinguish them. And the reason why you need to distinguish them is that the standard is abstract and the purpose is concrete. So the standard is man's life, the kind of life that a human being can live. But the purpose is your own life, you being some particular human being. And your own life isn't like a carbon copy of some generic human life, right? Each of us has his own particular, concrete, determinate life made up of particular, concrete, determinate actions in pursuit of particular, concrete, determinate values. Your career, your romantic interests, your artistic tastes and values and so forth, they're not the same as anybody else's or everybody else's. And substituting in my values for yours, even if both of us have rational values, is not going to be leading your life or making your life go well. But so what you want for your life is your values, things that you love and that form a self-sustaining whole, which is your particular one. What the standard of man's life does is it's an abstract specification of the types of values that any particular human life is going to have some of. So any particular human life is going to involve reason as a central value. But, it's your faculty of reason in your life, my faculty of reason in my life, and the particular things that we think about and make it our priority to think about are going to be different. This is even clearer when we get to purpose, right? Everybody is going to have purposes, and in particular is going to need to have some kind of productive career. But is that productive career running a railroad, or inventing a metal, or leading a strike, or inventing a motor, or being a philosophy professor, or a truck driver, or a movie star, or a doctor, or a lawyer? These are each separate concrete specifications under that abstraction of purpose. Everybody needs one, and it needs to play a certain level in their life, but it's not going to be the same from person to person.
So if you didn't distinguish between purpose and standard, you might think, well, what's good is whatever serves life, and where's some life I can serve? And so you'll go out kind of, saving people from burning buildings, and the same stuff that Eddie talks about in the first chapter, what the preacher said is the best, what's the best within us.
So you might not be thinking about serving your own individual life, but serving any life anywhere. But I think more likely than that, as a kind of error that comes from not having standard and purpose well differentiated, is that you would have a very hard time, you would have a hard time relating your own personal values that are distinctive to you to abstract categories of value. And so you would either have a tendency to take your personal values, you love this woman, this artwork, this career, and think that those are the values that everybody should have or love. And now you're not likely to do it with the particular person you love, but you are more likely to do it with, say, your particular career. Aristotle thought everybody should be a philosopher who's smart enough to be, right? Not able to abstract away and see how the kinds of things that he loved and that made life worth living for him in philosophy could exist in a different form for somebody else, and see what's the abstraction that's common to all of these things.
And Aristotle wouldn't have liked someone like Reardon for this kind of reason.
And there are other reasons for that, too, which I talk about in that. I feel like I'm being, I don't know what I'm doing. I feel like I'm teasing people by saying there's this lecture of mine that I think is really good, but it's not available. But,
But we hope it will be soon.
I hope it will be. Yeah, write to Ayn Rand campus and say that you want to. So you might be tempted to take your own personal values and think of them as universal values that everybody should have, and you might be tempted to kind of like treat the universal values as things that you should just have for yourself in a non-individuated form. So you should like think about what's good art, and I should like good art, and give me a list of good art, and I'll go like that art, or try to get that into my life, rather than thinking about, yeah, you want art you like to be good, but you're not going to like the same art, all and only the same art as someone else who has equally good taste in you as art, because art's meant to perform a certain function, and that function has to do with playing a role in your life and relating to your own other values and so forth. So there's a real kind of issue of the personal quality of it. And this is something Alan and I both talk about in different chapters of a companion to Ayn Rand. In chapter 3, which is on Rand's view of valuing, I talk a fair amount about this. And Galt talks in chapter 4 about morality, about the issue of what's sometimes called optional values. And I think his discussion there is really useful.
So one last topic under the man's life is the standard section. Mm-hmm. What is man's life? And there's a paragraph here on paperback 928, standard edition 1014. Man's life, as required by his nature, is not the life of a mindless brute or a looting thug or a mooching mystic, but the life of a thinking being. Not life by means of force or fraud, but life by means of achievement, not survival at any price, since there's only one price that pays for man's survival: reason. And I mean, I think this is something that there's a lot of people have questions about, and there have been scholarly debates about this. If the whole basis for this ethical theory is supposed to be just the fundamental alternative of existence or non-existence, which seems like it's trying to appeal just to bare raw biology, where does this extra stuff come from? The part about it's not just any old life, it's not just the mindless brute life. Well, why isn't the mindless brute life a kind of life too? And so why would she be able to justify a higher standard than that?
So are you looking for me to answer, or do you
Sure.
want to give an answer yourself?
No, I mean I'll chime in later, but
All right. Well, so there's been some debate among philosophers interested in Rand, who I think are too conventional in their way of thinking of philosophical alternatives, between two possible ways of taking this idea of man's life as the standard. So first of all, just in general, I think what everybody would agree with is what's meant by man's life. First of all, man here means the species human being, and it's being used as a generic term to refer to any member of the species. So it's not like we're trying to promote the life of human beings in general, try to promote as many human beings surviving as possible. Rather, it's try to promote your own life, but do it in accordance with this standard of promote your own life by achieving for yourself the things that are good for a human being, because a human being is a certain type of animal with a certain type of life. But then there are and so the things that are good for a human being will be good for you, since you are one. But the question is, what does this mean? And the two views that I think are mistaken. One is the view that all that really is required for man's life, or all that man's life really means, is that if you're a man, you're not dead yet. So we're thinking about what it takes to stop you from dropping dead. Tara calls this morgue avoidance.
Temporary morgue avoidance.
Momentary, I think, at one point even. But morgue avoidance, so let's take away the momentary, even long-term morgue avoidance. So we're just interested in how long does it stop you from dropping dead for. And really the only ultimate value is that you don't drop dead, or don't drop dead for a long time, and everything else is about whether it prevents you from dropping dead or not. The other view is that, no, of course we don't do everything we do just not to drop dead. We do everything we do to live a rich, full life. And this is what Aristotle would call living well. And so the goal isn't just living, but living well, where living well means living in the particularly human type of way. And so man's life includes content, on this view, that doesn't contribute to keeping us alive, but rather is just good in itself. It's good as the type of life that's valuable to or appropriate to a human being. And I think both of those types of view of a way in which a standard can apply are represented by different figures in the history of thought, particularly the history of Greek thought. But I think neither of them is quite right. What Rand's thinking about here is for a living thing to be alive, what a life is a process, as she puts it, or as Galt puts it, self-sustaining and self-generated action. And there are particular types of processes by which each type of living thing sustains itself. That is, the process in which the self-sustaining, self-generating form of action available to a thing of that species, of that life form. And for a human being, well, for a bird, that includes flying and whatever. For at least flying birds, it includes flying. For dogs, it includes smelling out food and chasing after it and so forth. And for plants, it includes photosynthesizing. For various different organisms, it includes various things. And for human beings, it includes centrally reasoning, being purposeful, having values, all the kinds of things that are characteristic of characters like Reardon and Francisco and Dagny and Galt.
It's noteworthy that in that nonfiction essay we were talking about, the objectivist ethics, when she talks about reason, purpose, and self-esteem, there's this slightly new language she puts in there that these are not just means to life, but the realization of the end of life. And
now, the realization, though, could make you think in the other way, that this is what life's for, as opposed to for surviving. But that's not right either. These are the ways that human beings survive. But it's not that they're good, therefore, because they keep our heart beating. Because our heart beating is also part of the way in which we survive, right? Our survival, our living, is a complex process that includes physiological bits like the heart beating and the lungs going in and out and the cellular metabolism taking place, but also includes the reasoning, spiritual, conscious component. And it's not that both of these are for the sake of the whole, not one for the sake of the other. And if one of them is more important, it's the conscious spiritual side, because that's the part that coordinates and manages and runs the rest. So that's what a human life consists in most of all. But it's crucial to that being part of a human life, that is part of how human beings survive. And human beings cannot survive in any other way. And that's now what a lot of this speech is about. If you are not surviving by your own thinking and reasoning, then you're surviving as a parasite off of someone else's thinking and reasoning. And those people don't have to let you get away with it. And they might not. And if they don't, then there's going to, they'll go on strike and you'll face the fate in the novel. But even if they do let you go on parasitizing off of them, the fact that you're not living in a way that's sustainable for a human being will have consequences. And at this point, there's a passage we should really read on this. The "No, you don't have to live as a man" passage.
Yeah.
Let me pull that up.
That's right here.
Okay.
No, you don't have to live. It's your basic act of choice. But if you choose to live, you must live as a man by the work and the judgment of your mind. No, you do not have to live as a man. It is an act of moral choice, but you cannot live as anything else. And the alternative is that state of living death, which you now see within you and around you, the state of a thing unfit for existence, no longer human, and less than animal, a thing that knows nothing but pain and drags itself through its span of years in the agony of unthinking self-destruction. And Alexandra, online in the chat, has a pithy comment. Entities can only act qua their natures in accordance with their identity. Lots of terminology in there, but she's referring to the discussion of the axioms that comes in just a couple of pages of the speech, and it's not. And these are not unrelated points. I mean, the people who say, isn't this stuff about reason, purpose, and self-esteem just something over and above the life, are committing the error that Galt is warning against, of saying that existence is one thing and identity is another. But Alexandra and Galt are pointing out that they're the same thing. To be is to be something in particular, and to want to be is you have to want to be something in particular.
I think that's right, and the wanting point is really important here. There's no such thing as wanting to exist without wanting to be anything in particular. And this brings us, we'll talk more about this soon, to the riddle of people like James Taggart, who Cheryl puts it right. You want to be a man like Hank Reardon without the necessity of being what he is, without the necessity of being anything. And she's terrified by that. Because he wants to sort of like get away with living, as I think someone put it, maybe Gina put it, or someone put it that way when we were up in Cambridge, or when I was up in Cambridge. They don't want to be anything in particular, and if that's right, thinks Galt, then they don't really want to be. And I think that's part of what Cheryl's realizing.
And that'll help us make some sense of the possibility of the morality of death, which we'll get to.
But the other,
enough,
I mean, the other part of it is if the other line here is it's not what the ultimate value is in a way survival, but it's not survival at any price, because only one price will pay for a human being's survival, as Rand puts it, and that's reason. And the other kind of life is not a human life. And what it means that it's not a human life is not that it's some kind of life that a human being can live, but Rand thinks ill of it, or Galt thinks ill of it.
Yeah.
It's a kind of life that is self-destructive, and it will destroy you to live like that. It is not self-sustaining. And if you are sustained while you're living like that, it's like if you're sustained while you're comatose on a respirator. You're not really living a human life.
You're a vegetable.
You're a vegetable, and you're being sustained by other people who are picking up the slack that you're not doing. Now, if it's because you're in a coma, it's not your fault, but it's nonetheless, you're not living a human life, and other human beings are keeping your body alive. Likewise, if you are functioning like a Jim Taggart, it is your fault, and you're not leading a human life, and other people are letting you get away with it, and they're suffering for it, and they shouldn't suffer for it.
And notably, in the previous story, we have two scenes that I think drive this point home. One is Dagny asks Galt, "What is it you're doing here?" Mm-hmm. And what does he say?
Living.
He doesn't say living well,
right?
He doesn't say we're living off the fat of the land. It's just like just living.
Yeah.
And also the scene where they're visiting Axton's house, and he says, "These are normal men. These are ordinary men. Mm-hmm. This is which normal by the human standard, which not enough people live up to."
And that's the other line I love like that is when in chapter 5 of part 1, when Dagny is first going to see Francisco, or she's remembered him and seen him in the past, but we've gotten the scene recounting their history together, and now she's about to walk into the room and meet him in the present tense for the first time in the novel. And it says something like, I can't do it exactly from memory, but nobody ever bothered to ask whether Francisco d'Anconia was handsome. It kind of seemed irrelevant. People described him as having the vitality of a healthy animal, but they knew something wasn't right about that. And what he has is the vitality of a healthy human being, or a healthy man, something so rare that people didn't know how to put it. Just the other side of this that I want to say is a lot of people get away with living a non-human life, in the sense that they don't die, everybody dies, but they don't, perish in the way lots of people are perishing in Atlas Shrugged, say on the train that in the Winston Tunnel, or they're not brought up in some disaster that leads to their death directly. That's the result of their non-thinking, but they would die if not for other people picking up the slack.
And for the vast scope of human history, they did by about 20, right?
Yes.
It's only in the last 100 years, 150 years, that they've started to do better, and that's because of the Reardons and the Dagnys
and that they've been left free.
Yeah.
But also, even when they are surviving for a long time, there are spiritual consequences to it. And we see that spiritual consequences to knowing that you are living in a cannibal way. And Skylar Online asked what this idea of moral cannibal
which we didn't get to answer.
means. And it's they're living by a morality that tells them to live off other people. And it's the two senses. The morality tells them to live off other people, but also the morality itself is subservient on or depends on cannibalizing people who live by a different morality. So it's not a kind of self-sufficient morality.
But you depend on those people,
right?
And then you've eaten them up, and they're not there anymore, and so you end up devouring yourself, in effect.
Yeah, devouring your brother and being devoured by your
brother cannibal love.
Yeah,
is the way that Reardon was
brother's neighbor. But there are spiritual consequences to knowing that you're not fit for existence, that you're living by a code that is unsustainable and that depends on people's breaking it. And this is why self-esteem is such a big part of this speech. Recall, it's reason, purpose, and self-esteem are the central values. And self-esteem is the conviction that your mind's capable of knowing, and therefore you're worthy of living.
And we're going to have a whole discussion separate about that.
Yeah, particularly in
broadcast.
connection with the third part.
We should probably move on to the values and virtues that we wanted to talk about.
Let's start us off on, get that ball
values
rolling.
and virtues.
I'm going to grab another.
So what are you getting?
I'm just getting a Coke. You want one?
Yeah, it's getting late because we started late. We talked a little bit already about reason, purpose, and self-esteem, which are the ruling values in the objectivist ethics essay. She talks about them as cardinal values, and interestingly, there's a little bit of a different organization there. But the virtues, we didn't talk as much about them. I mentioned a couple of virtues that I thought went well with certain characters who emphasized them. There's others that we could talk about along those lines. So, for example, Reardon learns a lot about honesty in this book. And
justice.
And that too, yeah. Starting with honesty first, the whole description of how recognizing that the unreal is unreal and has no value, and the deception makes you dependent on the non-thinking of others. That's exactly Reardon's realization when he, after he's been basically lying about the affair, keeping it out of the public view, and he's become their pawn. He's become the public's pawn because he has to go around hiding this from them, caring so much about what they think about his affair. And he realizes that even this kind of white lie, which was told to protect Dagny's honor, was basically subjecting them both to the control of the public.
Yeah. And I think Reardon, integrity really stands out to me as a virtue for Reardon. And
yeah, I had that too, because he's been sacrificing his standards to his family's standards, and
but doing it out of this kind of sense of rectitude.
Yeah.
Right. So he's been having a kind of failures of integrity, but which are due to a misplaced integrity. To he won't break his word. He stands by his commitments, and even in situations where it turns out those commitments and standards are invalid, and he shouldn't. So he's sort of a lot of his character is about integrity, and justice is also an important part of his character. Justice is really central to Ragnar, of course, who says that's and I think
his only love.
Yeah, and if I had to associate him with a value or virtue, it's justice. I would, more so than reason. I mean, yesterday we were talking about reason, purpose, and self-esteem as corresponding to Ragnar, Francisco, and Galt, and I could see purpose especially for Francisco and self-esteem especially for Galt.
And I want to single out Dagny for independence, because not only, it's obvious that she's acting on her own judgment versus that of the looters and versus that of James. And I have a degree in engineering, Jim. When I see something, I see it. She judges Reardon Metal for herself, but more notably, even in relation to Galt, right? And Galt recognizes this on her part, that she has to see for herself that it's time to go on strike. And as of this point in the novel, she still hasn't, even though she basically is cheering for the strikers, which is really interesting. It's like, well, that's good for them, but it's not good for me yet. I don't recognize that that's good for me.
In connection with chapters 8 and 9, we're going to have to talk a lot about how Dagny's thinking about this.
Yeah.
But yeah, Dagny, and again, all of these characters have all of these virtues, and I don't think what we're saying now when we're talking about independence with Dagny is that independence is sort of the central virtue in Dagny's character, as opposed to, say, purposiveness, which I think is as central to her, but that we're getting these tremendous illustrations of independence and what it means in difficult circumstances through the plot circumstance Dagny said.
Those are the main things I wanted to discuss about virtues. Did you have other things?
Are there any we didn't cover? Reason,
we didn't talk about pride, but we talked about that last time in connection with Galt.
Yeah. So I think we've hit all the virtues we want to. People, are you able to see all the comments?
I've been going back and forth between the two streams we created.
Yeah, because I have
Pooja points out that how hard a person has to work to live depends on the society they live in, and I think that's what you were alluding to about freedom.
Yeah,
obviously, if
and
you're
what you
living
were
in a
talking
slave
about
society.
Just only a few hundred years ago,
Right.
that we've.
Dana says independence versus survivalism. I'm not sure what Dana means by that, but I could guess. And
Well, Dana, why don't you fill us in?
yeah, tell us more, Dana. But she may have in mind here. Look, Dagny's the focus of independence for Rand is independence of judgment, and it's not that you're living on a desert island all by yourself,
but it's not
without
just,
any inputs from
it's
society.
not just independence of judgment, because it's also the fact that you are yourself producing the things you need to survive, so that you're
that's
not
consistent with living in as a trader, which is something emphasized in the later part of it.
So it's not just that you independently judge but don't act on it. You also act on it. You independently judge, you independently form values, and you take action to achieve your values. But those actions can involve interacting with others who are doing the same, and that's what a trade is. As opposed to what then? What would be a violation of independence? Substituting someone else's judgment for your own, substituting someone else's values for your own, doing what they want you to do rather than what you want to do, or trying to get the things you need from other people without earning them, having them do the work for you, them make them for you, and not giving them anything in return. So you either do that by mooching off of somebody, a la Philip Reardon, or by looting off of somebody, a la Orrin Boyle.
Though interestingly, and we haven't gotten to this part of the speech yet, it's going to come up in the second half, there's going to be a place there where Galt's going to argue that the people who want the unearned in matter aren't really doing it just because of material benefits, right? They're doing it because it gives them a phony sense of self-esteem.
Yeah.
And that does come back to the issue of independence of judgment, doesn't it?
And to pride, and self-esteem. Did you think it was just a conspiracy to seize your money? Francisco asked Reardon. You who know the source of money ought to know it, or wealth ought to know that it's much more than that. That's not an exact quote, I don't think, but it's pretty close.
And Galt uses the language of a conspiracy against the mind in the speech later too. I don't think we've gotten to that part yet.
Well, we can talk more about trade and force and rights. I think we'll talk a little about politics next week, and maybe in one of our supplemental sessions we'll have after the novel's over. So shall we move on to the morality of death?
Unless we wanted to say anything about emotions and happiness.
Oh yeah, that's a big topic. Well, yeah, so if we talk, in a way we were talking about it when we talked about man's life, right? And when we talked about your purpose being your own life. Sometimes Rand will talk about your purpose being your own happiness also. And she really sees those as two aspects of the same thing, because if your goal is life, your goal isn't to avoid the morgue for a moment longer, and then a moment longer still, and then a moment longer still. Your goal is to be living successfully, living in a way where you're flourishing, where you're not constantly at risk, where your life is going well. And that means a life in which you're busy achieving and having success at achieving your values, the values that you've set yourself to go after. And that those are values that are self-sustaining values, right? They're values that cohere into a life that's a self-sustaining whole. And happiness is, in Galt's view and Rand's view, the emotional state of achieving such values. Galt describes it as a state of non-contradictory joy. So that you have the feeling of achieving something, and it's not tarnished or diminished by a frustration that you know that achievement is going to lead to or clash with, but rather it's heightened by the knowledge that it's going to lead to and help and support all your other values.
And notably that there's logic as the art of non-contradictory identification, and existence is identity. So you have to, those all form a whole. Happiness is the kind of psychological reflection of living an integrated life in accordance with your identity.
And you can see this in Axton's advice to Dagny when she's in the valley, and in Dagny's own thinking, because Dagny's in this terrible conflict over Galt, that she wants him, and yet he's, it's him or the railroad, and they're on opposite sides. And and maybe she'll never be able to get him. And yet Dabney is sort of very deeply internally on this premise of values should be achievable, life should be integrated, life's a whole.
So she needs to check her premises.
She does, right. But she thinks, no, my values can't lead me to this. My values, which are the achievable, the real, the this worldly, can't lead me to a situation where my highest one is unachievable. And Axton says, we talked about this earlier, Galt says there are no conflicts between rational men. And Axton revisits that in that last scene. And he says, when you check your premise, you'll see that there was no need for any conflict. Once you have the right principle, you'll see that the conflict isn't necessary. Not a conflict between good people, and neither such a horrible internal conflict as the one you, Dabney, have had to bear over this past month. So, and that's part of we never had to take it seriously. Recognizing that the conflicts that you face, there's many of them, are the result of errors and are avoidable.
Al in the chat says Dagny was always the most frustrating character for him. Maybe because she was taking it seriously for too long and then only realizes eventually she didn't have to.
Is this Al who's often with us in New York?
We didn't have to take any of it seriously. This is technically a spoiler, right? Because
we're already in part 3.
Never mind. Pooja has asked a question twice now, so I think she really wants us to say something. I thought we already did say something about this, Pooja, but maybe you could clarify what we haven't said. Can you speak to or just restate this line, man's life is the standard of morality, but your own life is its purpose? Maybe you could say something about that again, just in connection with what we've said now about happiness, since that's also described as the purpose of morality.
Yeah, I would... I'm not sure what more to say than I have, but just for the general point, a standard is an abstract thing. So, if you're building a building, right, you're going to build a particular building that there's going to be something with a particular purpose that this one building has to fill. And everything is going to be selected in accordance with that particular purpose, and the particular site it's on, and the various features like that. But then there's general content about building, what makes a good building in general, what all sorts of buildings have to have, including some particular purpose for that building. All buildings have to have some and be integrated around it. That you're going to avert to in your thinking to help guide you in your selection of and creation of the particular building you want to make, to help you form an idea for a building you want to make, and then to create and achieve that building. And likewise, in pursuing some particular life, your life, you're going to need to have general knowledge about human beings and human lives to figure out what kind of things can go into a human life. And what's the relationship between the things in a human life? So, for example, the idea that a productive purpose is central to a human life, the idea that other relationships with people are very important to a human life, but that they can't take the place of a productive purpose, so that any other people who you may choose to share your journey with have to be other people going in the same direction by their own power, which is something she says, Galt says in the context of the virtue of independence. Incidentally, this is a little bit out of the blue, but I've noticed on Facebook, and Tyler from Strive has shared some of these with me, and some other people have. There's a really interesting series of videos of Will Smith, the rapper come actor, giving life advice.
The one about responsibility.
There's one about taking responsibility for your own, and you can't be responsible for someone else's happiness. Almost all of the ones I've seen, maybe there's going to be some other one I'll think is awful coming out tomorrow, but all the ones I've seen so far have been really good. And really connected to objectivist ideas, to Rand's ideas, or good concretizations of them. And in particular, there was one about him and his wife talking about how neither of them could make the other happy, and it has to be that each of them's
and they split up.
Their own goal. I don't know if they did.
I think they did.
No, but I think they were this, unless it's an old video and he's since split up with her. But it seemed like he's talking about someone he's still with. and they each decide, I can't make you happy, you can't make me happy. We each are living for, we each are achieving our own happiness and sharing it with one another. And I can't come to you for you to make me happy. I have to make myself happy and share it with you. And that's very much, well, it's one, Dagny's attitude towards her relationships, but it's also what Galt says in the speech, independent travelers going in the same direction, each by their own power.
I think we should move on to the morality of death
Yes.
at this point. And the first thing you wanted to discuss under this heading, because it's the first thing that Galt discusses, or almost the first thing, is the connection to original sin.
Well, I wanted to say one thing about it.
More generally first? Okay.
Yeah. So the way this section starts, even before original sin or leading into original sin, this is on 1025. I don't want to look this way because the mic won't pick me up well. So, but I have the book open.
I got
this
it.
page,
I got
yeah.
it all in here.
Me too. We have multiple copies of this book here. Okay.
25.
Yeah. So this is the beginning of the section that.
Death is
This
the
is
standard.
the beginning of the section on the morality of death on
Paperback
1025.
938 for those of you who are looking.
Yeah, and 1025 of the standard big edition, whether it's paperback or hardcover. So death is, well, I'll just read it. He's been talking about the morality of life. He's been talking about the trader principle. He's been talking about part of the morality of life is the evil of initiating force. And in that context, he's talking about when you force somebody, you're trying to rule them by fear, and you're acting on the premise that Reardon identified as there's just fear and pain and the absence of those things, no positive values. And the people who think that fear is the best motivator for people, they have lost the concept of the difference between fear and joy. And he says, you guys don't wish to live. You don't wish to live. And only the fear of death still holds you to the existence that you've damned. And you're darting in panic, he says, right? And what is it that you're panicking about? You don't want to name something about yourself, right? Now, where have we seen this? Well, Jim Taggart, right, is constantly avoiding looking and naming what he is and what he's doing.
What he's motivated by.
Yeah, and the purpose of your struggle is not to know, not to grasp or name the thing that I shall now state to your hearing. And this is the first time we get this point actually put in words in the book. It's been implied very often before, particularly by Francisco. The purpose of your struggle is not to know, not to grasp or name or hear the thing I shall now state to your hearing, that yours is the morality of death. And that marks the transition to this, what by the kind of outline we're using of the speech is section 3, the morality of death. And that section then begins. Death is the standard of your values. Death is your chosen goal, and you have to keep running since there is no escape to from the pursuer who is out to destroy you, or from the knowledge that that pursuer is yourself. Stop running for once. There is no place to run. Stand naked as you dread to stand, but as I see you, and take a look at what you dared to call a moral code. And then I'll just read the next sentence, and then we'll stop. Damnation is the start of your morality. Destruction is its purpose, means, and end. So what's going on here? Well, the people who've accepted this morality of death, and I think we'll see that there's a range of different types of people who count as having accepted it to some extent or another, and who it's influencing, and some of them are more culpable for this than others. But the people who have accepted this morality are don't, insofar as they've accepted it, love their lives. And they're following a code of values that is directing them towards death. And death is the standard of your values. Death is your chosen goal. So you've in some sense chosen death. And yet they have to keep running because they're afraid of getting destroyed. And they don't want to acknowledge that what's destroying them is themselves. And in what sense then have they chosen death? Well, they've chosen some kind of ideal that maybe they're not being clear to themselves about what that ideal really means or amounts to. But what it really is or means and amounts to is death. And then we get damnation is the start of your morality. destruction is its purpose, means, and end. And then we have to think about what it means for damnation to be the start, destruction to be its purpose, means, and end. And this is, I think, the key to really understanding the morality of death. And then Galt goes on to talk about each of these points and sums it up by saying the name of this monstrous absurdity that's kind of at the center of the morality of death is original sin.
Before we say anything about original sin, I just want to emphasize something that I think is unique here, because there's a caricature of, it's an awful caricature of Rand's view, since she's known for being an advocate of selfishness, that her view is everybody's selfish. And this is the part of the speech that should tell against that most definitively, because it's not only that she doesn't think that not everybody wants to live, but more than that, some people on some level don't want death, and are afraid to admit that, but they do, and
either they want death, or they've accepted death as an ideal,
right,
which aren't exactly the same thing. Right. They're related. But you could accept something as an ideal and not exactly want it, but still be directing yourself by it or steering yourself by it. And I mean, in part, what's going on here is Galt saying, the ideals humanity has had have all amounted to death. They've all been steering us towards death. And what humanity needs is a new ideal, a new moral code. And one that people have been following insofar as they've been really living, people like Reardon, but not explicitly, not having identified it as such. But yeah, it's definitely, selfishness is a tremendous achievement in Rand's view. It's not that people are automatically selfish, or that people are automatically selfish in one sense, like going after their immediate interests or something, but not in some deeper or better or enlightened sense. It's total BS. People are Jim Taggart and Mr. Moen, to pick someone who's not the most awful guy in the world, or Fred Kinnan, who's a lot worse. These are not people who are in any sense that's intelligible acting for their self-interest, because self-interest is a complex idea. It requires thinking about what you are and what's good for you. And if you're not doing that, if you're just going by the feelings and the urges you have in a moment, a lot of the urges you have in a moment are to just avoid pain, but avoiding that pain might be bad for you. It's to help others. It's to just do something that you're habituated to doing. JG on the Facebook page has been talking a lot about habituation and breaking out of habituation. A lot of your urges or whims or desires in a moment are are just force of habit, in effect. And none of those things are necessarily or always good for you, or even usually good for you. You're a being of a specific nature, and what's good for you is something specific. And if you're not directing yourself towards that, if you're just doing what everyone's always done, or what you feel like doing in a moment, which is just what you're used to doing, or what other people have done before you and you've kind of absorbed as the thing to do now, then you're effectively acting at random. And for a being that has a specific nature, that needs a specific type of action to be living, to act basically at random is to act self-destructively. It's not to act in your short-range self-interest or in this kind of self-interest or be selfish in this way. It's to be unselfish. And it's self-destructive.
And maybe here's a good place for me to bring in the Dostoevsky reference, because I've been reading a lot of him lately, and Rand did too, though I don't know that this is a particular idea that she got from him, but she is far from the only person to have recognized that people are capable of self-destruction, and on a basic psychological level, to the point where he recognizes not everybody is selfish and some people are the opposite. You see this in Notes from Underground, which I know you've read and taught,
Yeah, and I used to teach it in a course along with Atlas Shrugged, and it was when we got to these chapters of Atlas that we were reading Notes from Underground.
And he's in that book, he's explicitly trying to address the so-called psychological egoists who thought everybody pursued their interest. But Crime and Punishment is another great example. The villain, Raskolnikov, basically kills a woman. And I read a review recently that it's a murder mystery where the mystery isn't who done it, but what motivated him to do it. And as you get further and further into his psychology by the end of the novel, you realize not for any good reason at all. And it was a self-destructive kind of act. And similarly, in Brothers Karamazov, Dmitri is a lot like this. And for more, I'd recommend reading those books.
I mean, Rand definitely read those books. And I mean, she talked about Dostoevsky being, I mean, she described him as displaying, I forget exactly, but she talked about him as a chamber of horrors.
Through a chamber of horrors.
Going through a chamber of horrors with an expert guide, yeah. But she talked about him as being very perceptive about evil, I think.
And notably, I mean, he's not himself somebody who thought you ought to be self-interested. He's a Christian altruist, but part of the reason he's emphasizing the range of options in your freedom is so that he thinks you'll have the ability to exercise Christian selflessness. Not this. He doesn't think it's the self-destructive type, but.
Well, so let's talk about that Christian selflessness now, because we're getting into the morality of death. I don't think the morality of death is synonymous with Christianity. It's meant to be something wider than that. But Christianity is, I think Rand thinks, an example of it. Christian ethics, at least as she understands them. And original sin is certainly a concept that comes out. I mean, I guess it's the episode that's original sin is in the Old Testament, but it's a concept that's more associated with Christianity than with Judaism. So,
Because of Paul.
What?
Because of Paul.
Because of Paul, yeah. So, what shall we say about this? Well, first, let's back up and think. In a lot of Rand's nonfiction writing and in a lot of what people say about her, she's seen as an opponent of altruism, right? And altruism she views as the view that the purpose of life is to serve others. But I think the real essence of what Rand thinks is the essence of conventional morality and what she's opposed to, by the time of Atlas Shrugged anyway, is not specifically serving others. It doesn't have to do with the other people aspect of it. That was kind of more her focus when she was writing The Fountainhead. But by the time of writing Atlas Shrugged, it's not you're serving yourself versus others, but you're pursuing values versus that you're sacrificing. And she thinks the standard morality, the conventional morality, the morality we're brought up with in different forms, the morality of death, is a morality about sacrificing. The essence of it is give up values. And then what you're supposed to give them up for, whether it's your neighbor or God or your race or all people everywhere, or unprotected wilderness or whatever it is, that's incidental. The central thing, the thing that's seen as ennobling about it, is the giving up, is the sacrificing. So the essential of this is that it's the morality of sacrifice. And the various religious versions of it or secular versions are just, what's important about it is that it's about sacrifice, and these other things are, again, incidental to that.
The passage you're looking for, I might be able to find it better than...
Yeah, no, and I have it up here.
Okay.
So everything else is incidental to its being the morality of sacrifice. I was pausing because my book is now wet because I put it in where I spilled my glass while I was trying to solve the technical problems. Anyway, I have other copies.
It's understatement. Didn't we count once the number of...
How many did we come up with?
I think Greg has something like 40 copies in one form or another.
I don't think it's 40, but anyway,
it was 40.
I had a number, and then I have some copies that were Alan's.
It's not just like the same copy. Like you've got different translations.
Oh yeah,
different editions because you are a scholar and you need to have different paginations.
Yeah, but also Alan collected copies in languages he couldn't read, and He gave some of them to me before he
Anyway,
passed away.
digression.
Yeah, so what I think is really central here to understanding this idea of a morality that's about sacrifice. And I think that it's the morality of sacrifice is what this is, and then if you go all the way with sacrificing, that leads to death. And so it's the morality of death is the same thing as the morality of sacrifice if you think of it as carried out through its conclusion. Damnation is the start of your morality. Destruction is its purpose, means, and end. So the morality starts with damnation, and it's a destructive morality. Its means is destructive. It accomplishes what it does by means of destruction. That's why it was devised, and that's something we really have to think about. And that's the end goal of it, is to serve that purpose of destruction. But it begins, right, damnation is the start and destruction is the purpose, means, and end. And it begins by damning man as evil. And that's the, I think, real key to this. And that's why original sin is where it starts her focus. It starts by damning man as evil. And what this damning man as evil amounts to is damning yourself as evil. And so it doesn't, damning yourself as evil for things about you that aren't open to your choice. For the fact that you're a human being, for the fact that you have to survive in a certain manner, for things that can't be changed, and in fact for doing the things that you need to do to survive, and the very things that the morality of life identifies as good. Right? So it damns you for those things. And as a result of that, it starts by doing that. So it doesn't start by upholding something good and then saying, all right, now relative to this good thing, we're going to downgrade man. It starts by damning man. And then it takes you as a standard of the bad. And if you think about all of the moral codes that are out there, other than Ayn Rand's and other than the remnants of a pro-life morality that I think we see shards of in many different philosophies. But if you think what there's moral consensus on, it's that selfishness is bad, that you should be trying to serve something higher than or other than yourself. They don't know what it is, but it's not you. Maybe if you think about what are the minimal characteristics people think something has to have in order to be a morality. And you could think about this if, Ben and I are philosophers by training, so what philosophers think, right? It has to be something that can be in an opponent relation to self-interest, to count as morality. That's what really was crystallized by Immanuel Kant, which is one of the two reasons why Rand sees him as a kind of major historical destroyer.
The technical terminology they use these days is agent-neutral value.
That's one of them, yeah. But but you get your idea of agent-neutral value, but whatever you think is an agent-neutral value, by saying, well, it can't be specific to an agent. Or if you think of the Kant's way of putting it, is it can't come from inclination. Or there's a recent book, which I like as a really good exposition of this, that's trying to figure out what's central to different codes of ethics and how, called The Beloved Self, that takes its departure from Kant, by Alison Hills, I think is the woman's name who wrote it. I've got it somewhere around here. Anyway, a very anti-egoist book that takes Kant as its point of departure. And it's pretty explicit about this, that it's not saying do whatever harms you, no, but it's generating the standards for what could count as a moral value by the fact that it's the kind of thing that could constrain self-interest, can be opposed to self-interest, that you can be commanded to sacrifice to. And you can see, particularly in Kant, even though Kant's actual ethical demands might require you to sacrifice less than some other ethical systems, and a lot of people point this out about Kant, he thinks you even have duties to yourself. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, the whole idea of a moral imperative is developed by contrast to something you want, by contrast to something that's good for you. It's a type of the whole idea of morality, according to Kant, and I'm stressing Kant because he's just such a pivotal figure in the history of ethics, and I think every ethicist since has been operating in his shadow. And I think he was identifying a strand that's been in moral thought I mean, he thought of himself as kind of isolating out from our ordinary concept of morality, the very core of it. And I think he's right that he did that for something that's been central to moral thinking since ancient times. And it's this self as the standard of evil, that what it is to be moral is to place something above yourself. So if you start from that idea and then try to articulate what that is, it's the anti-self, your own values, is the kind of very origin of moral thinking, according to conventional thinking, and so according to what Rand calls the morality of sacrifice or death. And then whatever positive ideals people have are developed from that. So it's God, and God is, I mean, nobody really knows anything positive about God. God's just not you. And we'll talk more about this, and not human, when we talk about the morality
mystics.
of death. But let's talk more about original sin. So,
Yeah, well, I thought it was interesting that there was this language about the robot. It comes up twice. If man is evil by birth, he has no will, no power to change it. If he has no will, he can be neither good nor evil. A robot is amoral. Now, that's the point she's making. First, to stress that it's bizarre to call something a sin if it's not up to your choice. Robots don't seem to be the kinds of things that can do right or wrong. But then it comes up again in the paragraph where he describes all the different aspects of human nature that are damned as evil, and she closes by saying, whatever he was, that robot in the Garden of Eden who existed without mind, without values, without labor, without love, he was not man. And it's just notable to me that in that nonfiction essay, The Objectivist Ethics, she also describes this example of an immortal, indestructible robot, which she uses to show sort of what the boundary conditions of the concept of value are. That if something it can't act in a way that makes a difference to its existence or non-existence, then there's nothing that can be good or bad for it. And that's, I think, related here, because the robot in the Garden of Eden certainly doesn't. If you strip away our mind, our values, our labor, our love, then this doesn't look like a human after all. And extra point, it's also worth thinking about whether the very conception of a Christian God or Judeo-Christian monotheistic God would be something like this kind of robot. If nothing can make a difference to it, if God doesn't have values that make a difference to its existence or non-existence, if it doesn't have to work to produce anything, it's omniscient and omnipotent, and
the whole
how can it have things that are good for it, and then how can we be serving them by its own conception?
I mean, the whole idea of God is anti-causal, and people who believe in God, insofar as they believe in it, don't believe in causes. It's just not compatible. I mean, you can't think of a God and think causally. I mean, even the idea of God has means and works in mysterious ways. If you're omnipotent, you don't work in any way. A way is something that you work in a way because you have an identity which enables you to accomplish things in one way but not another. If your will just be done by your willing it, then you don't work in any way. When you want something, that thing happens. And of course, that's a contradiction of the law of causality, of the law of identity. It's not something that's really intelligible. But I think a lot of the point of it is its non-intelligibility.
And later in the second half of the speech, when we talk about the mystic's psychology, there's going to be discussion about how mystics of both muscle and spirit, in her view, view the minds of others as like unto omnipotent gods, and that's what frightens them.
And we can see that in Jim Taggart in his dealing with Dagny already.
And explains a lot about why they want to try to shackle the minds of other people, because then they get to have omnipotence over the omnipotent. And
now, this isn't to say that every religious person is a mystic in this way or thinks this way, even if Rand and I am right about this. But this is part of the doctrine, and it's inherent in the doctrine. And insofar as you're taking it seriously, I think you're not thinking causally. In whatever areas of life you're able to take it seriously. And it's a compromise. Just like I think Galt thinks, to whatever extent you are idealizing and following this conventional way of moral thinking, what you're idealizing and following is death. And that's we're Well, it's hard to know where we are on our time because we had so many technical problems getting people able to see our feed. But I do want to talk about, and let's maybe close on the relation of the soul-body dichotomy to all of this.
Okay.
And I mean, there's so much more we could be talking about in the speech, but so 'cause recall that the soul-body dichotomy has played a really big role in this book.
Yeah.
Right.
Especially with Reardon.
With Reardon, Reardon's been kind of on the tail of it, trying to. He's been suffering from it tremendously in his romantic life, but then he was wondering what it was that motivated people to cheer him in one moment, and then be on the other side in the next moment, and then eventually he realizes that he's guilty of this same contradiction. It's the soul-body dichotomy. Dagny's also is sort of all about, from early on in the book, the unity of soul and body, and yet her spirit or her soul is more and more detached from her actual life, insofar as she's not living her values, and Francisco and Galt both point this out to her. So this has been a theme, in a lot of ways throughout the novel. What does he say about it here? Galt say about it here? Well, here, what happens is when you draw a dichotomy between spirit and body, each of them, some people believe in both and some in just one or the other, but each of them is supposed to have goals of its own. So the body has urges, like, for inner spring mattresses and sex, thinks the bum in the diner.
The body has a mind of its own?
The body has a mind of its own. The body have urges of its own, right? And those urges are bad, think the people like Lillian Reardon and the bum in the diner. The one who says, man has only two capacities for sex and industry and so forth, right? Those are bad because they're bodily and they're base and so forth, right? But the body has values, desires of its own. And then on the other hand, there are these spiritual desires and values which are never really too clearly identified, the ones Lillian claims to live for, right, that are somehow supposed to be opposed to the values of the body. They don't have any clear identity except that the values of the body are less important by comparison to them and to be sacrificed to them. And Galt's view is that both of these are non-rational, that the body can't form goals of its own. There are needs, like your body will die if you don't get certain things, and you can get hungry and so forth, which is a sensation. But the body doesn't give you values, doesn't give you goals. Even the sensation of hunger doesn't tell you what will satisfy it. And unless somebody discovered what things were edible, nobody would know to want those things. And certainly nobody would know to want things like, cars and electric generators and iPhones and positions as presidents of railroads, unless somebody else had come up with those things, or nobody would want it. So, all the kinds of things that, in fact, people like Jim Taggart say in the novel desire. So values, even the allegedly bodily ones, are formed by the mind. And in response, yes, to needs about us that involve our bodies as well as our mind. But the values are generated by the mind. They're come up with by the mind. And so to think of some values or urges or drives as belonging just to the body is, as Francisco put it, like thinking that ore, just melts itself into steel without anyone thinking to do it. It's taking a product of the mind and treating it as something that just happened. And then the allegedly spiritual desires are desires that are unimplementable because the things can only be achieved in reality. So they're goals that have no way of implementing them, which is, so they're not really goals. They're not really things you can pursue. And again, they're non-rational. So both the spiritual desires, both the idea of a spirit as something that might motivate you, that's unrelated to a body, and the idea of a body that has urges of its own, are both kind of mockeries in Galt's view of valuing, which is an action of the mind. And so both of these, the spirit side and the body side, are anti-value. They're kind of mockeries of values. They're a way of thinking that denies the possibility or existence of genuine values and denies the efficacy and role of the mind.
This connects to a topic that we skipped over a little bit earlier, but I think it's important here, and that's the role of the emotions. Because I've often thought that if Rand didn't have her very unique theory of the emotions, she wouldn't have the same case for the integration of mind and body, because in her view, and there'll be more about this later in the speech as well. Emotions are the products of your thinking, and yet emotions, by their nature, are they're psychosomatic. They have an effect on your body, and they motivate you to act. And so they're kind of the glue between mind and body in an important way. And if you have the more conventional view of emotions, that emotions are just products of your body, blind instincts or whatever, animal urges.
Or that there's some kind of mystic revelations from God or the numinal world in the case of the higher emotions.
There's an idealist and a materialist version of what emotions are, right? But Rand's view has emotions that basically glue mind and body together and make them inseparable. And there's so much discussion of the emotions in this book. And I, earlier in our discussion of especially the first third of the book, tried to put a lot of emphasis on this, especially as you see them developing in Reardon. And that's significant because it's Reardon who has this mind-body problem. And yet you see he's got what he needs to solve this problem right there, because he's thinking, where are these emotions of mine coming from? Why is it that I'm not able to motivate myself to care about my family, even though my mind tells me that I have a duty to them? Well, maybe it's because only part of his mind tells him that, and the deeper part of his mind doesn't really believe that he has this duty, and so he's not really able to feel, and he's not really able to motivate himself, and all he needs to do is to correct that contradiction in the two aspects of his mind, one of which thinks he does have the duty and one of which thinks he doesn't, and that's his mind and his emotions, and therefore his body will be more integrated.
Yeah, if you think of it as the two sides of it, right, the idealist and the materialist side of the emotions are just their view, right? You can hold one view. You can think they just come from some mystical, some non-physical, spiritual other plane, or they could just come from the body. You could think one thing about some emotions and one thing about the others, right? So you can think, all of our emotions are just coming from the body without the input of thought or reason. Or you can think that that's true of like desires for food and sex and such, but that the feeling of respect for duty, or the feeling of love, or the feeling of obedience to authority or something comes from some supernatural force, right? As in different ways religionists and Kant and so forth all think. But if it's right that values come from the mind and that emotions come from thinking, and emotions being something different than a feeling of hunger, but the kind of response you have when you are passionately want something or angry and indignant at something, these things have parallels in the other animals. And we might call those emotions, or we might not, depending on how we want to use them. We might call them by the same names, anger. We might not, or we might not, depending on how we want to use them.
When animals have emotions, their responses to animal knowledge as well. So it's not like the animals' minds are detached from animals' bodies. They're not.
Yeah, but what we mean by the mind, or what Rand means by the mind, I think, is in part the whole faculty of consciousness, but in part the specifically human form of it that operates by choice. And a lot of things that happen automatically for animals because their values and their modes of action are inbuilt and modes of motivation are inbuilt, don't happen automatically for human beings and vary from one human being to the next or from one human culture to the next. because it's our particular method of consciousness that's involved in it. And our method of consciousness is one that operates by choice, that can be taught, but then that each person has to choose to implement. And this idea that emotions come from thinking isn't unique to Rand. Aristotle had a version of it. The Stoics had a somewhat different version of it. But the kind of full range of it, and this idea, her take on it is unique, I think.
Well, and maybe this brings us full circle somewhat, because part of what distinguishes her from Aristotle is that she embraces the full range of values that the mind is capable of achieving in a way that Aristotle doesn't, which helps erase the last vestiges of the mind-body dichotomy that you see in Aristotle.
Aristotle still tends to take a lot of values as merely bodily and related merely to the needs of life, and other values as separate from that, and emotions as separate from that, and related not to the mere needs of life, but to the better life or higher life or life of the mind. And I think that whole distinction is what Atlas Shrugged undercuts. And so this is, I think, a pretty, in a way, Aristotle is like Stadler. I think a much more innocent kind of Stadler. Plato would be a more kind of, clearer-cut case. But I talk a little bit about this in one of the footnotes in The Role of the Mind in Man's Life, in Essays on Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. But
also part of what's happening with Reardon and his development is coming to see that reason is a value that unites both work and sex. And he hadn't seen these two. I mean, he at most saw reason related to work.
Right.
And even then, I don't know if he saw reason. I don't know if he saw it as kind of contemplative, theoretical reasons, practical reason at least for him. But in any case, he didn't see reason connected to sex at all.
Right.
And it's that integration between the two of them that gets him
this
to.
Is the point I wanted. You had said something earlier that it triggered a thought, and then I kind of lost that thought somewhere. I was looking to capture it back, and it's. There's a connection between values and actions, and values and causes and effects. And if you just have bodily values, or just have spiritual values, they're kind of isolated from the whole causal process, which is a life, a process of self-sustaining and self-generated action. Things that are pursued or worth pursuing and valued and wanted to be pursued because of a role that they can play in sustaining the whole life, which is a process of pursuing these things and of getting them and of keeping oneself alive by doing it. And it's the mind that does that work of grasping the causal connections, of putting the things together, of seeing each of these things not as an isolated object that you can go after or not, or get or not, but as part of this whole and worth having as part of the whole. And that is what Rand thinks gives rise to values. And that's why the mind is the source of values. The mind is the thing that identifies things in causal relationships and then chooses to build a certain world by achieving certain things that are in causal relationships, achieving certain things that are going to have certain effects, and achieve them by enacting the causes you need to get them. And it's that makes things important to us, that makes things matter to us. From the taste of a meal or a physical sensation to the accomplishment of building an industry or running a strike or whatever it is. And what's distinctive to her take on emotion is the kind of tremendous personal character of them and intensity of them and the seeing of the mind's role in all of that. And for me, the image of that, and maybe we can go back to this now and end on this scene, is something in chapter 5 that we didn't really pause over when we were there. But the sex scene between Galt and Dagny in chapter 5, which is, I think, the best of the sex scenes, as it ought to be, given that it's the best of the relationships from Dagny's perspective. There we go. This is on 956. Then, conscious of nothing but the sensations of her body, because her body acquired the sudden power to let her know her most complex values by direct perception, Just as her eyes have the power to translate wavelengths of energy into sight, just as her ears have the power to translate vibrations into sound, so her body now had the power to translate the energy that had moved all the choices of her life into immediate sensory perception. And now this is the sentence I wanted. It was not the pressure of a hand that made her tremble, but the instantaneous sum of its meaning, the knowledge that it was his hand, that it moved as if her flesh were his possession, and that its movement were his signature of acceptance under the whole of that achievement which was herself. It was only a sensation of physical pleasure, but it contained her worship of him, of everything that was his person and his life, from the night of the mass meeting in a factory of Wisconsin to the Atlantis of a valley hidden in the Rocky Mountain, to the triumphant mockery of the green eyes of superlative intelligence above a worker's figure at the foot of the tower. It contained her pride in herself, and that it should be she whom he had chosen as his mirror, that it should be her body which he was now giving, which was now giving him the sum of his existence, as his body was giving him the sum of hers. These were the things it contained, but what she knew was only the sensation of the movement of his hand on her breasts. There was a paragraph right before the one I started with. I started too late. But what you're getting is this contrast about what she's immediately experiencing, what she immediately knew in that sense, and what she immediately wanted in that sense, which was his hand on her breasts and his lips on her and all of these things. But what that means to her. And that, the ability to make a sensation, whether it's a sensation in sex or the taste of a certain food or the look of a certain artwork in your house or in a museum or the sound of a certain symphony or whatever it is, the ability to have that mean something to you depends on your having values and having something that your life means to you. And that you see this as being a part of that, and as serving that, and as being consonant with that. And that is something that's the work of a mind. It's not something that's bodily. And for a human being, who's a being that lives by in his mind, and who is capable of these powerful and intense values, and who's an adult, an adult human being, not an infant, we're incapable of experiencing, at least on the positive side, mere physiological sensations that on their own totally captivate us and bring us to any kind of state of ecstasy, like an infant can't experience that. But an adult human being whose span of knowledge is greater than that can't be fully pleased just by any feeling or sensation you can have. Even the sensation of an orgasm or of a really nice tasting beverage or thing or whatever it is. If those really transport you into some kind of state of ecstasy, it's because of the meaning that you attach to them. And that meaning is a function of what matters to you. And likewise, when you achieve a physical possession, whether it's some shoes or some money or a house or whatever, the experience of that is valuable and worthwhile is a function of the values you formed with your mind. And that's a function of thinking about causal relationships. How are these things going to fit together into a whole? And do I choose that whole? And how are they going to support each other? And if you're thinking of urges of your body on the one hand, and then spiritual commandments on the other that are somehow detached from that, those are both, and you're thinking that life is some kind of contest between those two, then what you're leaving out is the mind. And if you're thinking that what you have to sacrifice is the selfish values of this world, values like sex with someone you really love, values like a career you really want, if you're thinking that those have to be sacrificed in the name of something higher, then what you're thinking is that the mind has to be sacrificed. Your mind has to be given up for some allegedly higher thing, which in fact, as we'll see more next week, has no identity.
Just to clarify what you're saying, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that it's because of the fact that the mind identifies values that we experience passionate ecstasy about things.
And that it forms the values. It's not they're there already as values.
Right, good. And so it's because of the fact that mind does that, and therefore gives us the possibility of this kind of ecstasy, that when you're asked to give up the ecstasy, you're giving up the mind that
Yeah.
creates it. Is that
And
the idea?
yes, and likewise for any of the diets, whether it's an ecstatic thing that you might experience in sex with someone you love, or the satisfaction of seeing your metal be poured, which metal you know that you can pour
Good.
because you've, and you can reliably pour because you've vertically integrated your business, or whatever accomplishment it is that you're proud of and happy with, or achievement that means something to you to achieve because you've achieved it using your mind. And when you're saying don't be selfish, the self is the standard of evil. When you say, to take another word, reap not nor sow, don't take any pride in that. You can't achieve those things. And it's wrong to value those things in those ways. What you're saying is give up the mind, throw out the mind. And let's bring this and end it on how this relates to the plot of the novel. Galt's strike consists of granting those demands.
Showing what it looks like to have a world without all of that.
And so we've taken away the people who aren't sacrificing the mind. We've given you a world where the mind's sacrificed, a world that has no joy, and a world that has no life. People are dying. And so now you must choose to perish or recognize that the anti-mind is the anti-life. And is that how that section of the speech ends? It's pretty much how. It's near to the end of it. I stepped on my own dramatic ending by asking if I got right
You did.
what the ending of that part of the speech is. But I think this would be around page, if I'm right.
I know the passage.
I know the passage,
you're
and if I'm
talking
right
about,
that
I
it
can't
marks the
remember.
transition, then the passage would include on around page 1034. Well, it's
Close to
somewhere.
the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
speech.
So it's closer to the beginning of the section.
Yeah.
But we're recognizing that this is the anti-life. And so then the question is, where does this code come from? And what motivates it? Both in the regular people that accept it, some to a greater degree and some to a lesser degree, and moreover in the originators of it and the real proponents of it. And we're going to talk about that as one of our main topics next time.
But there's two choose to perish lines. There's one at the beginning that you were quoting more closely, but then there's a second one, which is, I think, in the transitional part. The degree of your ability to live was the degree to which you broke your moral code, yet you believe that those who preach it are friends of humanity. You damn yourself and dare not question their motives or their goals. Take a look at them now when you face your last choice.
Good.
And if you choose to perish, do so with full knowledge of how cheaply so small an enemy has claimed your life. And
Good.
that's then the transition to the section on the mystics.
Yeah, or your teachers.
Which we shall begin to talk about on Tuesday night.
Good. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being with us. Any last comments people are making?
No, but we're getting some thanks and good nights.
Good.
So good
So
night, everyone.
good night, everyone, and we'll see you on Tuesday.